Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God.
Okay, we are going to start this morning on a study of Genesis history, and I'm going to do this in two different ways. Over the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to view segments of the movie Genesis History. I've broken it down into small sections, or I've divided the video up into sections as they broke it down, so that we can have discussion in between. And then when we're done going through the movie, we're going to go through the Bible study that was developed to accompany the movie. But because you haven't seen the movie yet, I want you to see the movie, but we can't see it in one setting in Sunday school. There's not enough time. If it was just the way I did my dissertation, we'd be here a long time, but that is no joke. But I want to start with reading of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis first, so that you have that in your mind as we begin to watch the movie Genesis History. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 31. In the beginning, God created, that's a baseball term, by the way, in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. You like my background that I have for that? And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. How much did you contribute to this project? God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it be separate, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruits bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, so on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made it, and God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and even winged birds according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with its seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Okay, there's the story, the account of creation. This is the first part of creation, the first statement of creation, let's say. And then as God moves into the second chapter, he goes into a little bit more detail. It's not a second round of creation, it's more detail. But Dell will talk about that as we go through the movie. At any time that you want to stop and have a discussion, just let me know and we can stop it and we can have a discussion. There'll be small segments, and at the end of each segment we'll have a discussion. Any questions before that? Did you sleep too much last night? Okay, here we go. There's no audio right at the beginning, so there will be. Yeah, it's an old one. It's on typewriter even. No. Yeah, it's good with them all.
You know, I grew up in country like this. My dad and I would ride our horses up to these amazing high mountain lakes. We'd ride back into some pretty remote wilderness areas with incredible streams and meadows and wildlife. I love it here. Look at this canyon. It reminds me of the Grand Canyon. You've got this little stream, you've got these steep canyon walls. How long do you suppose it would take for a stream this small to remove this much material and cut the canyon this deep? This rock has a history, just like I do and just like you do. It came from somewhere. A lot of these rocks have been dated to be 350,000 years old, up to 2 million. That's pretty old. But it might surprise you to know that all of the geological formations that we see here, the canyons, the layers, even the plants, are younger than I am. When I was born, there was nothing here but a vast forest, hundreds of feet below where we're standing right now. In fact, before 1980, most people had never even heard of Mount St. Helens. It was in that year, on May the 18th, that molten rock created a steam blast with a force of 20 million tons of TNT. Avalanche debris and other flows from the eruption laid down all of those layers rapidly, up to 600 feet thick. A couple years later, there was some more volcanic activity that created a mud flow that cut out this entire canyon. It also cut through deep bedrock, all in a couple days. Isn't it amazing what a little bit of information from the past can do to help change your view of the present and the present world around you. There are a lot of assumptions made by a lot of people about the history of the earth around us. The question is, how do those assumptions affect how we view that history? But more importantly, how do they play into how we view science and the Bible? Did God create the world in a few days or billions of years? Is mankind descended from apes, or did God create us instantly in his image? Was there a global flood that destroyed the earth, or is that a myth? In other words, is Genesis history?
Okay, that's the first section. That's why it paused. Linda's looking at me like, what happened? Did you break it? That's what she was thinking. Did you break it? According to no, he's not an old Earth. According to geologists. No, he used to be. Those of you that went through the Truth Project with us will remember him talking about this a little bit. As late as doing the Truth Project in 2010, I think it was, he was still an old Earth creationist. And in the process of writing and doing the Truth Project and talking to some of the experts that he's talked to, he was confronted by the reality that if we don't get Genesis right, what do we get wrong? And he'll talk about this some more later in the movie, but there are a number of things that are for us a real problem if we discount Genesis 1 through 11. And a lot of things get established in the very first chapter of the Bible that hold for the rest of the Bible. And as he was becoming confronted with that, he then began this study, and the end result was you have to conclude you're a young Earth creationist or not accept Genesis 1 through 11. And so this is really a story of his transformation from a young Earth creationist, or from an old Earth creationist to a young Earth creationist. Other questions? Nothing really to be questioned about, I think, but
when we think about the history of the earth, there are a lot of things we need to consider. But one of the most fascinating is the account of the flood. Was the whole earth covered with water? Genesis says the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. So if the flood was truly global, wouldn't there be a lot of evidence? I'd heard of a scientist who had spent over 40 years studying this question. When I spoke to him, he said he had a great place where we could see evidence for the global flood. Steve, I got to admit, I've been here several times, but every time I come here, it is breathtaking.
Besides being at home, Grand Canyon is my favorite place on Earth.
Yeah. So, Steve, tell me, what do you see here?
When we look at Grand Canyon, we see the inside story to the ground beneath our feet. And we kind of have a layer cake here, don't we, of strata that have been eroded for our benefit to see the inside structure of the Earth. These same layers are also in Colorado. We're also in Illinois, also in Pennsylvania.
So when you say sedimentary strata, you're talking about the layers that we see.
Yes. So the lowest layers are formed first. Those are sediment grains that were mixed, separated, and flowed in here from different directions and accumulated one on top of another. And then, of course, naturally, they convert to rock.
So you're saying that the solid ground we're standing on right now, if we went back in its history, it'd be liquid?
Yes. So the ocean is doing some amazing things, and water of incredible power is depositing the layers we see in the canyon.
And are there fossils in all of those layers?
There are marine fossils through all the layers. But the standard explanation is there were 17 different advances and retreats of the ocean over the North American continent, and it was extended over hundreds of millions of years.
And what is the evidence that you see here that would say that doesn't seem to make sense?
The 4,000 feet of flat-lying strata in the canyon are flat, and relative to one another, we look in between the strata layers and we don't see the passage of time in between layers.
You mean erosion?
Erosion, especially, and channeling on any great scale is not visible. And then we look at the strata themselves, and they provide evidence of rapid, very rapid sedimentation. Just minutes or hours is all that's needed to make layers.
Well, tell me about the story of these layers. I mean, how did they get here?
In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. My understanding is the ocean floor upheaval occurred. Some type of magma or earthquake propelled the oceans over the continent.
So that's why we get these marine fossils in these layers.
Yes, and we have 6 months the waters prevailed upon the earth, another 7 months or so for the water to subside. The 4,000 feet of strata probably represents the early and middle part of the global flood right here in Grand Canyon. We have other strata locally in this Grand Canyon region. That's called the Grand Staircase. We have about 10,000 feet, 2 miles thickness of strata on top of the Grand Canyon.
Higher than where we are.
Higher than where we are, and that represents the later stages of the flood and the retreat of the floodwater. This surface was doubled by retreat of floodwaters. And as the flood retreated into the newly formed ocean basins, then the continents probably uplifted, and the ark, of course, was landed in the high country in the Middle East.
Well, there's some people who say that that record is about a local flood.
I believe it's a global flood, and all the high hills or the whole heaven were covered, a universal statement. But that mountains have risen since then, and we shouldn't measure the depth of the floodwaters by the present mountains of the earth, which are largely created during the flood and after the flood.
Well, the fact that we have all of these layers would be unknown to us if we were standing on them, you know, somewhere else, but they're known to us because they've been cut out. How did that happen?
Well, it was the story that we all learned in grammar school. Okay, Colorado River, over tens of millions of years, cut the Grand Canyon. Most geologists have jettisoned that idea. It's hard to sustain a canyon like this for tens of millions of years. You can't imagine a canyon enduring that long with erosion.
Is that because it would have eventually the sides would have collapsed and broken down? Then how in the world do we get this all carved out?
Well, there are lots of theories, and personally, I like the idea of catastrophic erosion by drainage of lakes.
So after the flood, we have these large bodies of water, these lakes that are trapped.
There's evidence of the big lake in the Painted Desert, a place called Hopi Buttes, about 500 cubic miles of water in this huge lake.
And so the dam breaks, and all of that massive amount of water then is now pouring out and carving this.
Yes, and how long would it take to erode Grand Canyon? Maybe weeks, but not millions of years. Time is not a magic wand that solves all the geologic problems of the world. Jettison that way of thinking about millions of years and then start thinking about catastrophic process like you've seen at Mount St. Helens, and that'll help you understand Grand Canyon.
Everywhere we looked, Steve showed me evidence of the incredible power of moving water.
It quickly laid down these enormous layers, then quickly eroded them away. Steve wanted to show me where the floodwaters first hit the continent, so he took me deeper into the canyon. Stephen, you said you were going to bring me to the bottom. You weren't kidding, were you? We're at the bottom, aren't we?
So we're in this big side canyon to the main Grand Canyon, and we're looking at the granite basement rock, which is the core of the continent, if you will. And then we see the flat-lying strata on top of it. The boundary between the granite rock below and the Tapete sandstone above is this surface we call the Great Unconformity.
Why does it appear to be such a stark line? I mean, it's clear.
I think it's an erosional boundary of colossal scale. We're looking at something that shows the magnitude of flood flow over a surface.
And is it just here?
The Great Unconformity is continent-wide. I've seen it, I believe, in the Middle East. It's over in Europe. It's in Africa, and here it is under the North American continent.
So we've got this layer. How thick is this layer? What goes up from here?
Well, we have the Sauk mega sequence here, if you will, 1,000 feet of sandstone, shale, limestone that goes continent-wide. There are 4 other big sequence packages of strata that sit above it. Those are also very continuous like this. What we're seeing here is rather representative of the rest of the world.
It makes one really question the notion that this all happened because of a small local flood. We're talking about something enormous.
The power-moving water was beveling and pulverizing rock, depositing great thicknesses of layers and calling our minds to think about a global flood.
The conventional story is entirely different, though. It would say that there is a lot of time between each of these layers.
Some people have said that the Great Unconformity boundary here represents 500 million years.
You mean between the granite we see in that first layer of the sedimentary rock?
Yeah, they say that there may be 500 million years there. Okay, and that's what their explanation of Earth history would ask them to consider. Yet when you come here and look at this, nearly a featureless plain. It's not exactly a plain, but it's a gently rolling surface. And would that be the product of billions of years? Or would that be the product of the power of water planing off a surface? Time is foreign to a good explanation here. And so we want to explain what we see. Everywhere we look, we see the power of water. And it's water on a colossal scale, and that's the story here in Grand Canyon. It's not a little water and a lot of time. It's a lot of water and a little time.
Time really is the central issue when talking about the history of the Earth. How much time did it take to form what we see around us? It seemed clear to me that a global flood would have transformed the Earth quickly. Yet I know many people think that the world formed slowly over billions of years. What was the real difference between these two views of time? I needed to talk to someone who could tell me more about science and history and time. Since my background is in computer science, we met at a place where I had personally experienced some of that history.
Yes. Right. He's not alleging that that's true. He's saying what the conventional teaching is. And he's also one of the ones that has done a considerable amount of work at Mount St. Helens, which clearly, when you look at Mount St. Helens and you look at the strata laid down in minutes, that is very much like strata we see in other places. Snelling even took samples of the strata to other geologists and said, date this strata, and they dated it to billions of years, and then he showed them the video where it was laid down in minutes when Mount St. Helens erupted, and that big lake, Crater Lake, pushed everything through, and you have a new canyon, and you have these strata developed. Okay, let's continue on.
As we looked at the exhibit, I was reminded how much smaller and more powerful computers have become since I first started using them. Paul said our changing assumptions about computers were really a series of paradigm shifts.
So when I was 19, I read Thomas Kuhn's classic, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he describes this notion of paradigms. A paradigm is a framework within which you interpret evidence. So really, science isn't just about the evidence, it's about how you interpret that evidence. So this room, for example, we've got so-called mini computers here, but really they're not mini at all in terms of our current paradigm.
Yeah, today, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right? So really, to understand this question of origins, you really need to begin by looking at the governing paradigms, the two major views that we currently have about the history of life and the history of the universe.
And what are those?
On the one hand, we have the conventional paradigm. In the conventional paradigm, you've got deep time, 13.7 billion years, along which this gradual process, beginning with primal simplicity, ending in what we see today. All the complexity in life has to be built bottom up by strictly physical processes where no mind, no creator, no design is present. The second view we can call, let's say, the historical Genesis paradigm. Everything starts with a divine mind, a creator, an intelligence that plans and superintends and brings into existence reality. Events are happening on a much more recent time scale. The universe, the solar system, our planet, life itself, all of that begins fully formed as a functioning system.
It's not hard to see there's a radical difference between those two in terms of time.
When we look at the history of life on this planet, we've got a body of data, but depending on the paradigm that one adopts, that data will be interpreted in very different ways.
It seems that one paradigm is drawing on a history that was given to us.
Yes.
And another paradigm is constructing that history. Is that how you see that?
We have a witness to those events, and that witness is telling us this is what happened, and we have to take that into consideration when we evaluate the data.
Well, Paul, the reason this becomes serious is that we're not talking about a history of just boiling water at a certain temperature. You know,
Right.
We're talking about a history that deals with the origin of the universe. It deals with the origin of life,
Yeah.
the origin of humanity, the origin of sin and why there's evil in the world, the origin of the geological formations that we have around us,
Yeah.
the origin of language. I mean, this is history that is not minor.
Yeah.
This is dealing with major elements of humanity and where we are.
Yeah, you're talking about the origin of literally everything. And I think if we zoom out from that and say, well, what really is the difference between these two paradigms? It isn't a question of science on the one hand versus religion on the other, because both of them are scientific in the sense of looking at a common body of data. Really, at the deepest level, the difference is two competing views of history. What is the true history of our cosmos?
That does seem to be the real question. What is our true history? What actually happened? The conflict is not between two views of science, but between two competing views of history. Since Genesis was written in Hebrew, I wanted to talk to a Hebrew expert. What was actually in the original text?
Okay, so before we get on to the discussion of Hebrew, which is a fascinating part of it, and we'll want to get there, I want to go back over the two different paradigms that Dell's talking about. We have presented in what we read in Genesis chapter 1, we have presented a historical account of what God did and the time period or the way that he did it. We don't have a statement that says on November 5th, 0 year, he created the earth. We don't have that. And so we have to interpret that somehow. But that is in contrast to then what science claims to hold as a fact. Now, these are facts that are always in transition, which makes them questionable whether or not they're facts. For a long time before Lyell and Origin of the Species, Darwin, thank you. Before Lyell and Darwin began the discussion, there were only a few people that thought that we were millions of years old. And geologists began, Lyell was the first guy to write convincingly that there was a longer time period. And geologists started pushing that forward. Darwin read Lyell's book, and he then went down to the Galapagos Islands and began to observe what he thought was some kind of evolution. And he then began to press forward the concept of millions of years, and that number has changed over periods of time. You know, for a long time that number was less than 1 billion, and then it became 3 billion, and then it was stuck on 4.7 billion for a while, and now it's stuck on 13.7 billion years because of the necessity, as you saw the discussion of the Grand Canyon, the necessity of water slowly running to cut that gorge. Well, it couldn't be done in 10 years, couldn't be done in 1,000 years. Oh, it's going to be millions of years now. The problem that they don't deal with at the very beginning of that scenario is, if you go to the upper level of the Grand Canyon, it slopes the wrong way for the water to flow the way it flows. So the water couldn't have flowed that way at the surface. And so they have a real problem. What's the source of the water then if the water flows in the wrong way? Because the tilt of the upper level, so the Grand Canyon, they've pretty much proven the Grand Canyon couldn't have been cut by the Colorado River flowing through it, like they talk about. So you have these two competing views, or as Dell calls them, paradigms or views of history. We only have one that's recorded for us, and that's what God said in His Word. Everything else is conjecture based upon facts, and I hesitate to do air quotes, but in air quotes, facts. They're not facts necessarily, because facts can't change, right? A fact is a fact. It can't be a fact today and not a fact tomorrow. But facts in this area keep changing. So the problem that science has been confronted with is, how do we tell the story with our facts that are now changing? One of the presuppositions that modern science uses is the idea of conformity, that light travels at a certain speed always in a vacuum, and it's always done that. There's no basis in scientific discovery that says that's true, except our minuscule piece of history that we can view. So it's very possible that when God created, that He created the stars that are 10 billion light years away. In other words, it takes 10 billion years for the light to get there to here. That's how far they are away. And that's presupposing that light always travels at the same speed. Maybe, as we've already discovered, as our world is expanding, as the universe is expanding, that the speed of light actually has changed. And so that when God created those stars that are 10 billion light years away, light was traveling at a much greater speed than it is now. That's certainly possible. Or because the universe is expanding, that they weren't 10 billion light years away before. All of those things have to be accounted for, and accounted for within the confines of Scripture. That's the question that Dell is really focusing on here. Do we accept what God said in Scripture or not? And if we don't, then we've got all sorts of other problems. Any questions on that? I know I beat around the bush there, but correct. I don't favor that view, but that's certainly a possibility. And that would be seen in the fact that Adam was created an adult, not as a dirty diaper baby. Right. Right. And the trees in the garden. Right. Right. The answer to the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg, the answer is chicken. I mean, science may struggle with that, but the answer is clear from God. He created animals who then laid eggs or had live births and so forth. He was a day old, but he missed a lot of birthdays. And a 20-year-old mind. Right. I think there's some pretty good, we don't have time to go into it this morning, but there's some pretty good scientific reasoning to say that he didn't create them with light in progress, but that light travels at a different speed. Dr. Jason Lisle, L-I-S-L-E, Lisle, he's an astronomer and astrophysicist, and he has developed some pretty compelling arguments of the reality that there's not uniformity in how things have happened, and that it's very possible in space for light to have traveled at different speeds. Right. Yeah, Dr. Lisle has some pretty convincing evidence on that, and there's a number of theories. That's always been the Achilles heel for young Earth creationists. Well, you got stars that are 10 billion light years away, and we know that light travels at this speed, so therefore we've got to be 10 billion years at least. And there's lots of convincing arguments against that. Okay. It's very possible. As we get into the movie some more, there'll be some more discussion of that, and we'll see that, and maybe we'll be able to answer that question for you at that point. His methods change, though. So next week we'll start right here with the discussion of of what the Hebrew text says. One of the arguments against Genesis 1 through 11 being accepted as history is the fallacious argument that it's poetry. It's not poetry. The genre of the text is historical narrative. There's no poetry in it at all. And the Hebrew scholar that Dr. Tackett talks to next will discuss that, and we'll see that next week. You can answer a question, yeah. They didn't. A lot did, because there was great upheaval in the water, but not all of them died. Yeah. Yeah, you have to study the flood along with creation in order to get where we are today. Things were different pre-flood. The world was different. The shape of the world was round, but the continents were different. The Mount Everest was not as high. The deepest part of the Atlantic trench, I forget the name of the trench, was not as low. All of that changed in the process of the flood, and we'll see that as we go on. Father, thank you for your word and the truth of it, and that we can look into your word and see the history of your creation of the earth. We know that this is an important topic for us because of the reality of salvation being determined before the creation of the world, and by your promise and by your call, you called us to be your children. And so when you tell us about how you created, if you lied to us in that, how can we accept the rest of it? There's so much that plays on the reality and the truth of Genesis that we miss if we don't get it right. So help us as we study this topic and as we look at your word. In the service to follow, we trust that you would be honored and glorified as we worship you and as we fellowship together. We love you and we want to serve you.
Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.